Hello, my friends. That's right. We're back again with another collection of some of the best stories that are family-friendly ever aired right here on Weekly Spooky. Because as you know, every Wednesday we bring you another terrifying tale to titillate you and keep that sense of Halloween alive all year long. But often, they're not quite appropriate for the youngsters. These stories you can listen to in mixed company, with your young children, with your friends of questionable taste and horror. They're all welcome. These stories are scary, however. They're just relatively inoffensive. So please put this on while you're driving your family around or carving those jack-o'-lanterns and enjoy a whole bunch of big scares. And if you love what we're doing, go to your favorite podcast app, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a 5-star rating. But now, it's time for the story after a quick word from our sponsors. The Beast of Roca di Vaca by Morgan Moore. All right, kids, everybody going to Ranch Roca di Vaca, be on the bus in 5 minutes. The teacher shouted through a megaphone to a parking lot full of kids and their parents. This year, the decision for a class trip included a weekend at a ranch to learn more about agriculture and the kind of self-operated business that were most common in the surrounding area. While there were a number of ranches within the same area, Ranch Roca di Vaca stood out for being run by immigrants from Puerto Rico. To both the parents and the teachers, this meant the kids could learn not only about agriculture, but also about another culture as well. In the hustle and bustle of all the kids and adults getting everything ready, Patrick Adams stood with a group of his friends. Patrick was excited to go on the trip, especially since it gave him a weekend away from his parents. He loved his parents, but he was also 12 years old and was at that age when he needed time away from his folks to be on his own every so often. "Man, I can't wait to get out of this parking lot. No parents for a whole weekend," Sean, one of Patrick's friends, said with excitement. "Yeah, but we'll have Mr. Osborne and Mr. Riley as chaperones, plus all the people at the ranch," Tommy, another friend, mentioned. "Hey, I'll take it. At least they'll let us explore and have fun. Unlike our parents," Sean replied. Guys, Patrick started to say, a smile on his face. "It doesn't matter who is or isn't with us. All that matters is no classes and no parents for the next 4 days." His friends shrugged and nodded their heads in agreement. The three of them knew they'd do some schoolwork over the course of the trip, but the knowledge that it wouldn't completely be like school was something they were happy about. It was a kid's dream. "Last call! Everybody on the bus if you want to go to the ranch!" Another announcement came from the teacher, getting the attention of everybody in the lot. Parents gave their children final farewells as well as telling them to have fun and be safe. Patrick and his friends said their goodbyes to their parents and started to head towards the bus. The ride to the ranch took a couple of hours, and once there, the children were directed over to an area by a barn. In front of the barn stood an older man dressed in traditional ranching garb, with a dog sitting beside him. "Hello, everybody. My name is Michael, and this here is Picasso. Welcome to Ranch Roca di Vaca. We're excited to have you all here, and we hope that you will all have a fun time." The kids cheered loudly with excitement as the teachers clapped and cheered with them, though not as energetic. Michael smiled and bowed his head in thanks. "Thank you very much. Now, before we get all you kids settled into your rooms, we just want to set a few ground rules. First of all, you can see this is a big area with a lot of open land. We ask that while you stay with us, you not explore outside of the fenced areas at all. And that if you must venture out that way for any reason, make sure you have an adult with you. Being outside at night goes with that as well. Other than that, I hope that you all have a good time, and we'll see you later tonight for a campfire." Once night had fallen, everybody met back up at the location Michael told them to for the campfire. It was a fun time with hot dogs, s'mores, roasted corn, perfect for kids that had been cooped up all day with just snack food. Picasso went up to everybody and sniffed at them, trying to get some food before Michael called him back to his side. After everybody had eaten, Michael stood up from his seat and whistled, calling all the children to attention. "You guys enjoy dinner?" he asked, getting a thunderous applause in return. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. Would you all like a story? Assuming, y'all can handle it. The kids screamed at the man in front of them, demanding the story and promising that they wouldn't be scared. After a minute or two, the kids quieted down, ready for the story they were promised. Many years ago, back in Puerto Rico, on a ranch not too different from this one, my grandpa started to lose some of his livestock. Goats, cows, pigs, just about everything he had started to disappear. And when the animals would be found, they were dead and drained of blood. A couple weeks later, my grandpa went out with some buddies one night who also happened to be ranchers. As the night went on, my grandfather asked if any of them had experienced anything similar to what was going on at his ranch. To his surprise, they all had been dealing with the same things. Well, at least one of his friends had an idea. He claimed that it was a monster. Now, as one might expect, everybody in the room laughed at that point. But he stuck to it, saying that this sort of thing happened years ago, but suddenly stopped. Because of its affinity for goats, he named the beast El Chupacabra, the goat sucker. Sure enough, the animals suddenly stopped disappearing. Now for me, I'm not too sure about it all, but you never know. After all, why do you think we don't want you guys going out alone at night? Michael grinned as he finished his story, and an animal howled in the distance. The kids looked shaken a bit. The teachers, too. A moment later came another howl cutting through the night air, which caused the group to jump. Their host and storyteller laughed a little at the reaction the kids had from the multiple howls. No need to worry about those howls, boys and girls. That's the dogs we keep on the ranch to keep the animals in line. No El Chupacabras here. Taking his words to heart, everybody got up and headed off to bed after taking care of the fire. The next day brought hours of learning how the farm was run, a huge lunch spread, and hours of horseback riding, after which everyone was excited for another campfire. But once they got close enough to the ranch, everyone could see that something wasn't quite right. A ranch hand ran over to Michael, distraught. "Boss, it's terrible, just terrible," the ranch hand blurted out, feverishly. "What is it?" Michael replied, his voice remaining calm. "There's a hole in the fence where the goats and the pigs sleep and... The worker spurted out in a slight mumble. "Well, come on, what is it?" Michael said in a tone that was both commanding and now starting to be tinged with concern. "They're dead. All dead," he spat out. Michael found himself dumbstruck, and the kids were speechless, their faces twisting into horrific expressions. Without hesitating, Michael rode off towards the area the ranch hand had described, while the hand motioned the children towards the stable and instructed them to return to their rooms. Patrick was very concerned. After all, animals just dropping dead wasn't something that happened every day. He shared his concerns with Sean and Tommy, and while they did find it strange, it didn't seem to bother them or make them feel as weird as Patrick. Hopefully tomorrow would be a better day. Unfortunately for Patrick and the rest of the class, it was not a better day. All activities were canceled and the children were confined to the large dining area. Patrick managed to sneak away at one point and eavesdrop on his teachers, Michael, and some of the ranch staff standing just outside an open window. "What are we going to do?" Mr. Osborne asked. "Is there any way you and the children could leave early?" a female ranch hand asked. "No," Mr. Riley started. "Unfortunately, the bus won't be back until tomorrow morning. Unless you have something to transport all the kids and make the 100-mile round trip, we have to stay until 7 in the morning. "Well, that settles it then, doesn't it? Keep the children in their rooms for the remainder of the day. Only let them out for dinner. I'll have some of the workers stand guard by the doors. That way, if a child needs to go to the bathroom, they can have a chaperone. Tonight, me and some of the other workers will stay up to keep watch over the ranch." Michael spoke calmly, but seriously. The teachers nodded and Michael and his staff turned and left. "I cannot believe this is happening. I thought the school said everything about this place checked out perfectly fine," Mr. Osborne asked his colleague. "It did from what I saw. Besides, you can't control what goes on in nature," Mr. Riley replied with a sigh. "You're right, but still, you would think they'd have this more under control. Almost all the animals are dead. Drained of their blood. It's just weird," Mr. Osborne mused. "You've got that right," Mr. Riley said. The two then walked off, continuing to talk as they went. No way, Tommy said after Patrick finished telling him and Sean what he'd overheard. Yeah, Patrick, there's no way a monster is responsible for everything going on, Sean chimed in. Come on, guys, it would be one thing if they dropped dead, but I heard them say there was no blood at all, Patrick retorted. It could just be some wild animal that broke in, Sean offered as a potential explanation. Okay, so it is a wild animal, but the fences are made up of barbed wire. If any animal broke in to kill the livestock, it would have been cut from the wire. No blood, remember? Patrick shot back. All right, so it is that chupacabra monster. Why does it matter to us? If we're just going to be stuck here all day, then we'll be safe, Tommy said. Because wouldn't it be cool to say you saw a monster? Patrick asked. I mean, yeah, but nobody would believe us. You would have to have photographic proof. Wait, no way, Patrick, Tommy said, figuring out his friend's plan. Come on, Tommy, it's simple. We just hide after dinner so we don't get locked in here. We bring your camera with us and we go on a little monster hunt. Once we get our proof, we run off and sneak back into our room. There's nothing to worry about, Patrick explained to the two of them. Pat, that sounds really dangerous. I mean, if there is a monster, what could it do to us? Plus, we'd get in loads of trouble if any of the ranchers caught us, Sean mused. We're going back tomorrow. What possible trouble could we get in? I think you guys are just scared. You guys want to join me and have some fun before we go home, or do you want to just stay in here bored out of your minds? Patrick asked. His friends looked at him, and then at each other. After a few minutes of silence, the two spoke up together. Okay, we're in. That night, the boys put their plan into action. The tricky part was figuring out how to stay under the radar so that they didn't get sent back to their room after dinner. Patrick, Tommy, and Sean decided to leave dinner early and head back to their rooms ahead of everybody else. Once they were outside, the three boys carefully made their way into one of the barns and hid by a pile of hay and began to wait. Through the cracks in the walls of the barn, they could see the light shining in from outside, and, once the light faded completely into darkness, they emerged from their hiding spot. When they exited the barn, the calmness of the night sent a shiver down their collective spines. None of them were afraid of the dark, but being on the ranch at night, while a monstrous creature might be on the prowl, was something that put all three of them on edge. Patrick took the lead, brandishing a flashlight he swiped earlier from a storage closet in the building where the rooms were. He turned it on and looked at Tommy and Sean, who returned his gaze. The three boys nodded and then started to make their way around the ranch. They moved slowly and carefully, making sure they weren't spotted by any workers, but also making sure they didn't miss anything. This is boring, Sean whispered. Be quiet, Tommy whispered back. Back at you, Sean responded. Both of you, shut up, Patrick shot at the two of them. The trio continued to make their way around the ranch, not wanting to potentially have missed anything. After the second walkthrough, they agreed that there was clearly nothing going on and decided it was time to head back. When they reached the front of their building, they stopped for a bit. Well, that was a whole lot of nothing, Sean stated, yawning afterwards. I gotta admit, Pat, that was pretty pointless. Look, I know the way those animals died is weird, but we searched the whole ranch, twice. It isn't a monster, Tommy said. Patrick sighed and shrugged a little bit. I guess you guys were right. Sorry I kept you both up. But hey, at least we didn't get into trouble. Let's go to bed. The three boys started to open the door, but they stopped when a horrible shriek filled the night. They looked at each other in shock. Without hesitating, they raced to where they thought the noise originated from. As they got closer, Patrick went to raise the flashlight, stopping in sudden terror when he saw what was in front of him. The suddenness of his stopping caused Sean and Tommy to crash into him. The trio tumbled to the ground, sending the flashlight rolling away. When they looked up towards where the light shone, all three of them started in terror. In front of them was a creature squatting over a dog, licking its lips. The beast looked like a mutated mixture of a wolf and a bat, a sharp spike-like spine poking out from its back, its eyes glowing deep crimson. This creature, this thing, matched Michael's description of El Chupacabra. Patrick, Sean, and Tommy stood up slowly, fear taking over their bodies. The monster roared and started towards the boys. They ran, taking off as fast as they could. El Chupacabra roaring again and gaining on them quicker than they expected. So quick, in fact, it passed them and stopped in front of them, standing up in its full height, drooling and growling like a dog interrupted from eating. All three boys stopped suddenly again, sweating bullets with every nerve in their body on full alert. The monster started to walk towards them slowly, eyeing up its new prey. They wanted to run. They needed to run, but the fear paralyzed them in place. Tommy, Sean, and Patrick could think of nothing, do nothing. They were simply stuck with the towering, unholy creature in front of them. Suddenly, Picasso came rushing from behind them and jumped on the beast. The dog bit into the neck of its enemy and shook its head, digging in as much as it could. It seemed to work as El Chupacabra cried out in pain. However, it didn't work for long as it ripped the dog away from its neck before taking a bite out of it. El Chupacabra threw the dog away like a piece of garbage. Picasso hit the wall of the building and fell to the ground, staying there, motionless. The beast turned its eyes back towards the boys. This time, though, they had enough of their wits about them to start running again. The monster chased after them. Everywhere they went, the monster followed, cutting them off time after time. Patrick, Sean, and Tommy somehow managed to always pivot at the last minute, the beast shrieking in anger each time. Barks soon began to fill the night as the sound of the beast stirred the security dogs, soon joined by voices echoing behind them in Spanish. "We need to get inside! Anywhere!" Tommy screamed feverishly at his friends. The boys darted into the first building they saw, a small barn filled with farming equipment. El Chupacabra stormed in after them, ripping the doors off their hinges. It roared at them and once more began to move towards them. Patrick and his friends backed away from it slowly, grabbing anything they could to throw at what was in front of them, though none of it had any effect on the monster. Soon they found themselves backed against a table, each boy feeling around for something to use as a weapon, though their efforts proved fruitless. With the creature almost right in their faces, they came to the conclusion that this was it. This was where everything was to end. A bang shot through the barn, and El Chupacabra swung its body around. Michael stood there, holding a shotgun aimed at the monster. It rushed at Michael and slammed him down to the ground, then kicked him away. Michael crashed into the metal wall of the building, leaving behind a dent. As the creature was about to go in for the final blow, Picasso slammed into the leg of the beast and started tearing at its leg. The dog let go and backed up as its opponent shrieked. Picasso rushed at the thing, and the two went tumbling to the ground, biting at each other ferociously. Sean and Tommy sprinted over towards Michael, screaming out for help. Patrick, however, ran after the two fighting animals. He found where they were, but was unable to see the combat clearly thanks to the frenzy. Growls, barks, shrieks, and cries filled the air in equal measure as dirt flew everywhere. Finally, they backed away from each other, wheezing and breathing heavily, staring each other down, before exploding into violence once more. Patrick cried out and ran back to where Michael and his friends were. Once there, he found Michael was on his feet, Sean and Tommy by his side. "The workers are calling the police and arming themselves. Come on, let's get to safety," Michael told the boys. "But what about Picasso? He's still fighting that thing," Patrick stammered out in a worried tone. Michael looked at him, gulping a bit. He had forgotten that his dog had saved him from certain doom. The man knew he had to get to safety, to get the boys to safety, but he couldn't just abandon his friend. Without any more thought, Michael picked up the shotgun and ran off towards where Patrick had come from. Patrick and the boys followed after him. They stopped once they got to where Michael was standing, clearly in shock. When the boys looked where he was, they too became shocked. In front of them stood Picasso, covered in dirt, wounded and weak. On the ground was the monster, the beast, El Chupacabra, defeated. The next morning, the kids lined up to get on the bus to take them back home. Patrick and his friends stood beside Michael, who was all smiles and warm spirits as he said goodbye and waved at the various children. Picasso stood next to them as well, bandaged from his fight. When it came time for Sean, Tommy, and Patrick to board the bus, Michael looked at them. His smile still there, but he now appeared weary. "Thank you, boys, for all your help," Michael told them. "Hey, it's thanks to you and Picasso that we were even able to be any help," Patrick responded, patting Picasso's head. "Yeah, but what happened? You sent us back to our room before the police or your workers came to help. Did they see the monster?" Tommy asked curiously as Sean nodded in agreement. Michael's smile faded, and he took a deep breath. They didn't. I told Picasso here to drag the body away. When they were out of sight, I fired my gun and told everybody that it was a wolf. I said I shot at it and that it ran off afterwards. But what about the damage to the barn and the wall? Sean questioned. I told them that the wolf and Picasso caused the damage with how violently they were fighting. As for the wall, well, a wolf charging at you at full speed and slamming you into a wall is going to leave some kind of an impact, especially considering how big I am. Besides, that was an older building, so its walls weren't as strong as the others. Anyways, after the police came and everything died down, I had Picasso show me where he took the thing and buried it myself, Michael explained. Last call! All students on the bus! Pronto! Mr. Osborne announced through a megaphone. Michael patted the boys on their respective shoulders. Go on now. You don't want to be late. He smiled at them as he spoke. They smiled back and picked up their bags and started to walk towards the bus. When they got there, Sean entered first and then Tommy. Patrick started to enter the bus but stopped. He turned around and waved at Michael again. Patrick's eyes then moved downwards to Picasso, and he smiled at the dog. The dog wagged its tail and barked happily at the boy. But as Patrick started to turn back around, he stopped. Something caught his eye. He turned back around and looked once more at Picasso, and his eyes widened in surprise and growing horror. Picasso's eyes glowed a deep crimson.
That chupacabra is always getting into trouble, isn't he? You'd think he'd stop at goats, but oh no, his hunger's always growing, always getting more intense. So keep an eye out this Halloween. You don't want to end up being a meal for the legendary Puerto Rican goat sucker, do you? Our next story takes us to a place that many of us older folks have a fondness for, the mall. But what happens when you get locked in the mall and can't get out? Well, let's find out after a quick word from our sponsors.
A Night at the Galleria by Rob Fields. Esme Harker stood outside the Galleria enjoying the many lights that illuminated it. She couldn't wait to go inside, but she was waiting for someone. As she sat on the bench just outside the main entrance, she looked through the doors and saw the outsides of some of the nearby shops. To her, there was always so much life inside the Galleria. She had only been there on a few select occasions, but she remembered how it had lifted her heart and soul each time. Soon, she saw Theodore Holloway walking towards her. When he finally reached her, he sat down beside her. "I'm terribly sorry for us having to meet here, Esme," he said. "I wish I could have been able to bring you here in style, but none of the limo services would consider renting to a 12-year-old. He took her hand. "You deserve so much better than us meeting here. Like this." Esme smiled. "It's quite all right, Theodore. You know, you don't always have to try so hard. All you really had to do was suggest we come here." She gestured to the mall itself. "Shall we go in?" "Delighted." Theodore stood up, then helped Esme to her feet. Esme's eyes brightened as Theodore led her closer and closer to the main doors. Soon he was opening one of them for her. "After you," he said. Esme entered and felt her excitement rising as she gazed upon the bright lights of the many stores and entertainment venues that filled the Galleria. She could see some of the food court stands on the second floor. "I don't get it, Esme. How come you don't come in here on your own?" Theodore asked. "There's nothing keeping you from doing that, you know. You can come here anytime you wish." "I know I can, Theodore." She glanced at him. "It's just not the same without you here. This is our special place. We've had so much fun and excitement here, you and I. I wouldn't feel right coming in here without you. You introduced me to the Galleria, you know?" Theodore shrugged. "Well, Esme, we have to do something to enrich our lives. After all, there aren't too many places available for a 12-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl." "That's not true," Esme replied. "We have a whole world. Right here." As long as you're happy, that's all that matters to me. Oh, I am, Theodore. Believe me when I say that I am. The two of them continued walking around the Galleria and taking in more of the sights. Theodore could see the sparkle in Esme's eyes. It pleased him to know that Esme was pleased. However, the time seemed to go by faster than they realized. They had entered the Galleria at around 7 p.m. Now it was nearing 9 p.m. Closing time. The two of them sat on a bench near one of the big anchor department stores. Theodore saw that Esme looked a little sad. "You all right?" he asked her. She sighed and turned to face him. "It seems like we just arrived, Theodore. I know we can always come here whenever we want to, but tonight was special and just so much fun. I really don't want to go." Theodore gave her a gentle smile. "I know you appreciate this place so much that we mainly keep it for our special date nights. I never knew it held such a special place in your heart." She smiled a little. "When you first brought me here, I was amazed by its beauty. It's a beautiful work of art. I want to stay a little longer." Then Theodore suddenly had an idea. "Why don't we just spend the night here?" Esme's eyes and mouth opened wide. "What? You heard me. Why don't we just spend the night here?" Then Theodore explained. "We can have the whole mall to ourselves. We can do whatever we want here and without care. No one would even know that we were ever here. Date night doesn't have to end, Esme." Esme didn't need any further convincing and nodded her head. Theodore took her hand and they both got up. They managed to get out of sight of the security guards that patrolled the mall. They hid in the big department store nearby and waited until the lights were turned off and the gate was down. Theodore and Esme came out of their hiding places. Then Esme asked, "How will we ever get out into the mall itself if we're locked in this one store?" Theodore grinned and produced keys to the kingdom. Esme's eyes and mouth opened wide again. "Where did you get those?" "From the security guard's office when we were on our way here to hide," Theodore answered. "Wow, you're pretty sneaky," Esme complimented. "Anything to keep you pleased, Esme." Esme gave him a gentle hug. Then Theodore unlocked the gate. When they were on the other side, Theodore locked the gate back up. From there, they started walking around on the second floor. "Sorry, Esme, I know the bright lights and the crowds of people aren't here now, but..." "It's okay, Theodore. The Galleria is still a beautiful place. Even darkened as it is, we'll be just fine here. So, now that we've got the whole place to ourselves, what would you like to do first?" Theodore asked. Esme turned to face him, stopping them in their tracks. "You have the keys to all the stores, right?" "Right." Esme smiled from ear to ear. "We've got the entire Galleria to ourselves now. I think the real question is, what wouldn't we want to do?" Theodore smiled at knowing that Esme was again pleased. The two of them ran together throughout the mall. Whenever they came by a store that either of them wanted to go into, Theodore would locate the key and unlock the gate. They went into anything from clothing stores to entertainment stores to even a teddy bear shop. As Esme was relishing the plush new stuffed animal that Theodore had picked out for her, they came across a video game arcade. "I can't believe these are even still around with all those consoles people have in their homes," Theodore said. Esme laughed a little. "If you want to go in and play the games, open it up, and let's play." Once Theodore found the key, he unlocked the gate, and in they went. They turned on all of the games and started playing one right after another. Every now and then Theodore would look over his shoulder to make sure that no security guards were approaching. None did. They got to play all of the games they wanted to play. When they finished, they turned off the games, and Theodore locked the arcade back up. Before long, the two of them were in the food court and drinking frozen soft drinks at a cookie stand. Then Theodore looked to see if any security guards were around. When he still didn't see any, he noticed something else and tapped Esme's shoulder. "You want to take in a movie?" he asked her. Her eyes sparkled. "I would love to." So they went to the mall's cinema. They sat through a romantic drama while eating buttery popcorn and drinking frozen sodas. They had no problem getting through the movie. Again, Theodore smiled and felt high spirits. Whenever Esme was pleased, he was pleased. After the movie, the two of them went back into the big department store where they had waited until the Galleria was well closed. This time, both of them tried on different clothes. When they were dressed, they would present themselves to each other. Theodore laughed whenever Esme laughed. He loved to see her happy and laughing. They changed into different outfits and came out of their dressing rooms again. "You should keep that dress," Theodore told her. "It makes you look like a princess." Esme did a curtsy for him. "Thank you, kind sir, and perhaps you should keep your suit. You would certainly compliment me in it." Theodore bowed to her. "You're too kind, my lady." After a while, the two of them were in the bedding department and lying on beds across from each other. As they both looked up at the ceiling, Esme said to Theodore, "Thank you for tonight. This was so much fun." "I know it." Then Theodore sat up. Esme noticed and also sat up. "Is something wrong?" "Doesn't it strike you odd that we haven't seen a single security guard since the mall closed?" he replied. "You'd think they'd be making regular rounds." Esme looked serious. "Why, yes, you're right. We can go and see where they are." He nodded once. "Thank you for humoring me." She smiled. "Well, you certainly humor me." They got off the beds and exited back into the main mall itself. Theodore knew where the security office was located and led Esme there. When they were close enough, they slowed down. Cautiously, they walked until they heard a voice. "Yeah, it took a while, but I finally got the other guards out of the way," they heard a man say. They peeked in and saw a tall man dressed in a security guard uniform talking on a smartphone. "Just get over here," the man snapped. "I'll let you both in through the loading docks. Then we can make our way to the main office on the 3rd floor and get what we came for." Esme and Theodore looked at each other briefly. Then they returned their attention back to the guard. 10 minutes? The guard asked. "Don't be late. We planned this for far too long to let things go wrong." The kids quickly turned and scurried out of the corridor. They moved behind a kiosk and sat. "You were right to wonder, Theodore," Esme said. "No wonder there weren't any guards around. That other one must have done something to them. As big of a place as the Galleria is, they're not just going to have one security guard here. Well, what are we going to do?" Theodore took her hand. "It's going to be okay. He's not going to be after us." "Not unless he sees us," Esme corrected him. "And remember, he's got friends coming. We've got to find those other guards. We've got to save this beautiful mall." At first, Theodore wanted to tell her that this incident wasn't their problem. However, Esme had spoken. Once more, he wanted to please her. "All right, but we need to be careful." Esme nodded. "You have an idea?" Theodore thought for a moment. There could be a number of places where the other guards might be held at. Then he snapped his fingers and pointed to a nearby electronics store. "We need to go in here first." "Let's go." They got up and went to the gate. Theodore unlocked it and they went in. It didn't take long for Theodore to find what he was looking for. "Here we are." Esme gasped with delight when he pulled a set of walkie-talkies off the shelf. "I'll get some batteries." Once the radios were set up and tested, they left the store and split up. The plan was for Theodore to keep an eye on the loading docks while Esme looked for the guards. Theodore told her where she might look. They would keep in contact with their walkie-talkies. Theodore crept into the loading docks and saw the bent security guard waiting impatiently. It wasn't long before he heard the squealing halt of a vehicle just outside. The guard raised one of the loading dock doors and allowed 2 other men to come in. "It's about time you idiots got here," the guard snapped and started lowering the door back down. "Hey, traffic's bad for a Friday night," the first guy replied. The second guy held up a large duffel bag. "We got the stuff." "Good, let's check on the other guards before we get started," the bent guard suggested. Theodore followed them stealthily as they walked over to the far end of the loading docks. The bent guard opened what appeared to be a storage room door. Theodore gasped to himself when he saw the other guards inside. Tied, gagged, and unconscious. He went to a safe distance and radioed Esme. "The guards are down here, in the loading docks," he said quietly. "That guard has 2 more men with him now." "I'm coming," Esme replied. The crooks looked as though they were ready to leave. Theodore would soon have plenty of time to get the trapped security guards. Then, An unexpected thing happened. One of the crooks pulled a flashlight out and turned it on. He ended up dropping it in the process. The light just happened to flash where Theodore was hiding. "Boss, look!" the crook who dropped the flashlight cried. "There's a kid in here!" He pointed to Theodore. "Get him!" the guard yelled. "Oh no!" Theodore shrieked as he shot out of his hiding place and took off running. Theodore ran out of the loading docks and eventually back out into the mall. He had all three crooks racing after him. Eventually, he made his way back up to the second floor and to the food court. He quickly dived over the counter at the cookie stand and got out of sight. A few minutes later, "Where did that kid go?" he heard one of them mutter. "He's around here somewhere." That was the bent guard. "Well, he's got to be hiding in one of these stands," the third one stated. But Theodore's hiding place was short-lived when he heard Esme on his walkie-talkie. "Theodore, are you all right? Where are you?" Theodore didn't wait around. As soon as he popped up, the men were trying to grab for him. He quickly turned around and moved to the back. He was out the back entrance and into a corridor that led back to the main mall. He still had the men chasing after him. Theodore raised his walkie-talkie and told Esme where he was and what was going on. He told her where the other guards were. "Don't you worry about me. You just take care of those guards." "I'm not going to leave you, Theodore," Esme radioed back. "Never mind me. I'll be all right," he insisted. "Just get to those guards." He felt a hand grab him, causing him to lose his walkie-talkie. It fell over a railing and down to the first floor where Theodore could hear it shatter on impact. "Gotcha, kid." The guard wrapped his arms around Theodore and lifted him up. "No!" Theodore cried. But when Theodore came back down, his foot landed on the guard's foot. The guard cried out, inadvertently releasing him. Theodore took off running again. "Get him! Get him!" the guard yelled. Theodore had a bit more of a head start on them and ran back to the big department store. The gate was open enough to where he could slide underneath it. When he stopped sliding, he turned and moved the gate. He slammed it down and locked it with his keys. But his sense of safety would be very short-lived, as the guard produced his own set of the Kingdom keys. "Yeah, you better run, kid." Theodore turned and moved through the department store and soon came to the escalator. He hopped up onto the rail and slid down to the first floor. He turned and sprinted to the gate. When he reached it, he opened it and lifted it up. He ran to find Esme and make sure she and the other guards were okay. Suddenly, arms wrapped themselves around Theodore. "Got you!" The bent guard had snatched him up and was taking him down to the floor. The other two crooks were quick to assist. The guard mocked Theodore. "Yeah, you thought you were clever, huh? Didn't think we caught on to your little plan, huh?" "Let me go," Theodore shouted. The next thing he knew, he had his arms being handcuffed behind him. "Now we're going to take you back and leave you with the other guards." "Not sure how you got in here, kid," another crook said, "but you can be sure you ain't leaving anytime soon. You and the guards will all starve to death before anyone finds you." The bent guard spoke up again. "There's somebody else in here with him. He was on a walkie-talkie to someone." He grabbed Theodore's hair. "Who you with, kid? Speak up." Theodore wouldn't answer him. The guard persisted, but to no avail. The guard lifted him to his feet and pushed him in the direction of the loading docks. Theodore kept dragging his feet before the guard's helpers lifted him up and carried him. "We'll lock him up with the other guards. Then we do what we're here to do," the bent guard told the others. "We'll rob this place and get what's coming to us." "Why would you do this?" Theodore asked. "Why not?" the guard sneered. "You work as a security guard in a mall. You think you're gonna get any kind of good money? No way. You get it by learning the mall and knowing what places to hit. Plenty of stores here that sell expensive diamonds and jewelry. There's also the big safe in the owner's office on the third floor where the payroll and probably other valuable things are kept. The security cameras are all off. All we gotta do is make our clean sweep, be out of here by morning, and nobody will be any wiser." Theodore continued to struggle, but the crooks had careful hold of him. Just then, the crooks stopped when they saw a lone girl standing several feet ahead of them. She looked very angry. "Let go of him," Esme yelled at them. "Drop the boy and get the girl," the guard ordered them. "I'll keep the boy with me." The men obeyed their leader and moved to circle Esme, but Esme didn't seem the least bit intimidated. She looked from one man to the other. When the man on her left came at her, she leaped up and caught him in the chest with her foot to knock him on his back. When the second one tried to grab her, she turned around and pushed him. The guard couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the second man flew back into the nearby music store gate. He bounced off the gate and fell forward in a daze. Now Esme turned to the guard. "It's okay, Theodore. Do it." The guard heard the handcuffs snap. Suddenly, Theodore snatched the guard and lifted him up as he got back to his feet. "What the?" the guard yelled when he realized that Theodore was lifting him over his head. Esme approached them. "Are you all right, Theodore?" "I think so, yes." Esme gave the guard an angry scowl, then she hit him on the forehead and knocked him unconscious. Later, the three men awoke and found themselves tied up in the loading docks. The first things they saw were Theodore and Esme, only now they were wearing what seemed like formal evening wear. Theodore wore a tux and Esme wore an evening gown. "I'm so glad you're awake," Esme told them. "What is this?" one of the robbers muttered. "This is a very special occasion that you get to be a part of," Esme said softly. Theodore turned to Esme. "I was planning to make you that steak dinner you've been wanting at that fancy restaurant. You know, I can still do that for you, darling." Esme smiled brightly. "You're always so sweet to me, my soulmate." "Soulmate?" the guard asked. "You're both just kids." Esme turned back to the guards. "That's right. Theodore is my soulmate. We've known each other since the Middle Ages." "Esme saved my life, you know," Theodore said. Esme explained how she and Theodore had known each other since they were children of 6 and 7 in Europe, back in 1348. When the Black Death came and was destroying half the population of Europe, Esme had become infected and was on her deathbed. "Our housekeeper was very kind to me as a child," Esme said. "She was wise and compassionate. She was also one of the undead. I didn't want to die, so she offered me immortality. All I would have to do is let her sire me, and I would die for just a short time." Months later, Theodore was about to be taken by the plague as well. He was a very close and dear friend to me, and I couldn't bear to lose him. I sired him myself, and saved his life. Esme and Theodore both smiled and showed their robbers their long, glistening fangs. Their eyes were also red now. "That's right. We're both vampires," Theodore said. "And you three ruined our anniversary date. Everything was supposed to be perfect for my beloved Esme. We came here to the Galleria to celebrate nearly 680 years together. You see, Esme gave me my life back when I was about to die of the Black Death back in 1348. I only want to give her her heart's desire. She doesn't ask for much, except to travel so we may see many different sights and places. And let me tell you, she really loves this mall. We don't get here much, but it really puts a smile on her face. And I love to see her smile." Esme blushed. "Oh, honey." Theodore took her hand. "I know this isn't the wonderful steak dinner I promised you for our celebration. It's still not too late for it." Esme licked her lips and fangs. "But I'm really thirsty, Theodore. You can make me that steak dinner when we return here for another special occasion. Right now, I want them for dinner, and I want you to join me." Theodore sighed. "And who am I to say no to you, Esme?" They both turned to the robbers. "Don't worry, we won't kill you," Esme promised. "You'll all wake up with a bad headache and be a few pints low." Theodore raised his finger. "And you'll likely be behind bars. The security cameras will have all the footage of you three admitting everything. Not to mention what the guards will say once we untie them and let them out, after we've eaten." "I turned off the cameras," the bent guard grumbled. "There's nothing to see." "When I got my keys, I turned them back on," Theodore corrected him. "It's always fun to be able to run around knowing that the cameras can't pick us up. Since we don't reflect in mirrors, we don't show up on cameras neither," Esme added. "And now, shall we dine, Theodore?" "Yes, my love. Let's enjoy our special anniversary dinner." The three robbers struggled and screamed as the two teen vampires closed in on them.
Talk about a killer sale. I hope you're enjoying these family-friendly frights as much as I am presenting them to you. Please consider sending us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com if you like what we're doing here and you'd like to see us do other compilations of family-friendly frights or even compilations of vampire stories, werewolf stories, and other things from over 160 previous episodes of Weekly Spooky. But now it's time to go into a story about the dangers of technology. This one hits a bit close to home, and we'll listen after a quick word from our sponsors.
Ghosts in the Machine by Shane Migliavacca. She's a weirdo. She's a weirdo, Marcy Collins chanted under her breath as Janet Rogers walked by with her lunch. Marcy and her pack of hyenas sat at their table staring daggers at the new girl. She couldn't understand why they hated her so much. Janet had just moved to Foster, New York with her Aunt Tina. Her parents had died in a car accident a year ago, and since then, she'd been taken in by her mother's sister. They'd moved to Foster so Tina could take care of her sick mother. Janet's grandmother scared her a little. She was very religious, and not above cracking you on the knuckles if you got out of line, not to mention her vicious little dog, Jasper. Although, since they'd moved in, the old woman hadn't been too bad, due to her sickness, no doubt. Whatever the case, Janet would rather be in her room at that big old house than here getting harassed in the cafeteria. Janet found a table in the corner, by the window. She nibbled on her slice of pizza while reading a book, trying to ignore the drama around her, trying not to think about her mom and dad. Having an emotional breakdown in front of Marcy and the others would sink her already shaky reputation at school. After lunch, Janet waited for the cafeteria to clear out a little. Gathering up her books, she headed for the exit, hoping to slip out and head towards her next class. Marcy and her crew already appeared to have taken off, powdering their noses, no doubt, and gossiping in the bathroom. She'd just stepped out into the hall when a voice cut through her like a knife through butter. "Where you headed, plebe?" Janet spun around to see Marcy standing there with her pack of hyenas. The other girls snickered. If only Janet could do what she envisioned, knocking Marcy on the floor with one punch. "Leave me alone." "Where do you buy your clothes?" one of the girls asked. "Salvation Army, I bet," answered another. Marcy pawed at Janet's stack of books. "What's with all the books? You're always reading. Think you're better than us?" "No, just leave me alone." One of the girls shoved Janet, making her drop her books. A group of students stood watching, laughing and clapping as Marcy and her pals pushed Janet back and forth, till the dazed girl landed on her butt on the floor. Before she could react, they gathered up her fallen books and ran off. Scrambling to her feet, Janet shot daggers at the other kids. "Thanks for nothing." She ran down the hall trying to catch Marcy and her books. Rounding a corner, Janet noticed Marcy running up the stairs to the second floor. "Come on, slowpoke, geez, too many snacks?" Janet weaved through the kids milling about in the hallway in hot pursuit of Marcy, who was now on the third floor. Adrenaline and anger the only things keeping her going. Marcy darted into a room at the end of the hall. Music class. Empty this period. When Janet skidded into the room, Marcy was standing in front of one of the windows. The open window overlooked an alley behind the high school. Marcy dangled one of the books out of the window. She grinned upon seeing Janet. "Want it?" "Don't." "Oopsie." Marcy dropped the book, quickly grabbing another as Janet charged at her. She flung the second book before Janet could reach her. Enraged, Janet grabbed her by the arm, yanking Marcy away from the window. "What's all this?" an authoritative voice asked. The girls turned. In the door stood the white-bearded, burly music teacher, Mr. Fraser. "What the?" he stammered, equally angry and perplexed. "What the French toast are you girls doing in my classroom?" After spending the rest of the day in the principal's office, trying to explain what Marcy had done, Janet went to the alley behind the school where her book lay scattered about. Trying not to break down on the spot, she gathered her books up. Principal Palmer promised the other girls would return the rest tomorrow. Of course, he'd let Marcy off with a lame warning. Her dad was a prominent local lawyer. Some of these books had been her father's. He'd been a college professor. That's what she got for bringing them to school. Since they'd moved here, Janet had a target on her back. She dressed in grungy-looking clothes and liked to read, the opposite of Marcy and her pals. Janet should have expected they'd escalate things. Walking home, Janet wanted nothing more than to bury her head in a pillow and not come up until Saturday morning. She prayed Aunt Tina was in a good mood. Of course, that depended on how much trouble Grandma had been today. The house was the last on the left of a one-way street. The 3-story monstrosity had once really been something. Her grandparents had been pretty well off years ago. Not so much now. The house had fallen into disrepair. Paint was chipping off the outside, and wind had torn some of the tiles off the roof. Jasper came yipping and snarling at her as she entered the house. "Go play in traffic," Janet glared. "You little turd." Entering what had been her grandfather's study, the dog hot on her heels, Janet set the books down on the old desk. She'd put them away later. Right now, she needed something cold to drink. The large kitchen was empty. Maybe Aunt Tina was upstairs. Taking a can of soda from the fridge, Janet popped it open. She nearly downed the can's contents in one gulp, cold soda dribbling down her chin. Lowering the can, Janet jumped backwards. Her grandmother sat in a wheelchair staring at her. "What are you doing in here?" the old woman asked. "Just getting a drink." "Who are you?" the old woman cried out. "It's me, Graham. Janet." "Who? Jane? I don't know any Jane." The old woman backed up her wheelchair. "Get out of my house." "It's Janet. Your granddaughter." "You lie. I have no granddaughter." "Aunt Tina! Aunt Tina!" Janet hollered, scared and a little confused. The old woman wheeled away, threatening to call the police. After a few moments, Tina came storming into the kitchen, looking frazzled. "What's wrong?" Janet felt a hot tear rush down her cheek. "Graham, she doesn't recognize me," she sobbed. "Said she was going to call the cops." "Calm down, honey," Tina smiled. "I'll talk to her. Stay here." Tina left, leaving a confused Janet to dry her face and ponder what had just happened. She felt her head spin. First Marcy, and now her grandma. How could the day get any worse? Suddenly, the dirty dishes in the sink began to shake, vibrate, before flying out of the sink and crashing to the floor, shattering. She scrambled back, startled just in time for her aunt to come back. Tina looked at the dishes, then the shaken Janet. "What happened?" I don't know." She tried to explain to her aunt what had happened, sensing the woman didn't buy it one bit. "Is Graham okay?" Janet asked, sweeping up bits of broken plates. "It's her mind. The disease is affecting it. She's having trouble distinguishing memories from the past with those of the present, so for her, reality is one big jumble." Laying in bed that night, Janet stared up at the ceiling. Thunder rumbled in the distance as it started to rain outside. Her thoughts were focused on something from one of her father's books. What was reality? Was it high school? Her aunt? The storm outside? Or was it just through her eyes? Was it all created by her mind? If that was true, could she bring her parents back? No, she'd wished so hard for them to be alive and well after the accident. And nothing had happened. Eventually, she dozed off to the sound of rain pouring down outside. Waking again sometime later to the sound of rain hammering the house, a large thunderclap that rattled the entire building. All the rain was making Janet need to use the bathroom. A little groggy, she fumbled her way out of the bedroom, guided by bright flashes of lightning outside. Her bedroom was on the 3rd floor. When her mother and Tina had been little, their bedrooms had been up here. And when they'd grown up and left, it had been turned into storage space and a guest room. Unfortunately, there was no bathroom on this floor, which meant she'd have to go down to the 2nd floor. Stepping into the hall, the drip, drip, drip of the bucket at the end of the hall greeted her. She'd have to remember to check that in the morning. The roof was leaking up here, and she had bucket patrol. Janet had forgotten one day, and one of the buckets had overflown. The water had dripped down to the 2nd floor. Halfway to the stairs, and lightning lit up the night again. Janet froze in her tracks as a woman stood watching her at the end of the hall. "Aunt Tina?" she asked, her voice quivering. "Is that you?" Standing there, Janet could only hear her own breathing. Darkness enveloped her until the next flash of lightning. The woman stood closer now, reaching out for her. In the brief flash, she could make out that it wasn't her aunt. Bolting, Janet ran back to her bedroom. She sat on her bed after blocking the door with her dresser, listening to the storm outside while never taking her eyes from the blocked entrance. That woman, in that brief glimpse of her, there had been something familiar about her. She tried to place where she'd seen that face before. Her fatigue got the better of her, and towards morning Janet fell asleep for a couple of hours. She woke to knocking at her bedroom door. "You awake?" her aunt asked. "You'll be late." I'm up, Janet answered, clearing the cobwebs from her head. Janet looked across at her door. The dresser she'd pushed in front was back where it belonged. Had it been a dream? That strange woman? There wasn't much time to ponder last night as Janet hurried to get dressed and ready for school. She scarfed down some breakfast and headed out to wait for the bus. Third period, Janet sat in computer class working on her project. She tried to concentrate on the work that needed to be done. Typing in code, something began to change on monitor. The screen flickered. The lines of code began forming a woman's face. Jumping back, Janet looked around the classroom to see if anybody else was experiencing the same thing. They all appeared to be calmly going about their work, some whispering and joking with one another. Nothing out of the ordinary. Turning back to the screen, a face made of green code, vaguely resembling a woman's, stared back at her. "Find me. Find yourself," a voice crackled through the speaker. "I can help unlock the world for you." What? Suddenly, Janet was pushed forward into the desk. Getting hit from behind, she turned to see Marcy and her posse walk by. "See you in gym class, fruitcake." Crap, gym class. Was the period over already? Turning back to the monitor, the face was gone. Just the code of her project appeared. Quickly saving her work, she headed to the gym, her least favorite place in the whole school. Today they were outside playing field hockey. Of course, she was one of the last chosen. Janet hung back during the game. She wasn't very good at it and tried to stay away from the action. Watching the others play, Janet thought about the face on the computer. It was the woman from the hall last night. She was sure. Although the face was made of computer code, it had the same familiarity to it. She didn't dream that. "Coming at you, weirdo." Marcy glared at her from across the field. She hit the hockey ball towards Janet, ensuring everybody would come charging at her, Marcy included. Janet felt a sharp elbow jab in the ribs, followed by a push, sending her to the ground. Looking up from a face full of grass, she saw Marcy smiling down at her. That was it. Janet got up, jumping on Marcy. She wrestled her to the ground as the game stopped. The other girls cheered as the two fought on the ground, rolling back and forth, throwing punches and pulling hair. The firm hands of Miss Anderson pulled Janet off of Marcy. Most of the girls pointed their fingers at Janet, silently accusing her of starting it. It was off to the principal's office, once again. This time, by herself. They'd called home and left a message on the answering machine for her aunt. Janet considered erasing it, but she was fairly certain the school would call again if they didn't hear from Aunt Tina. She decided to face the music and get it over with. Walking home, Janet dreaded opening the door. Jasper would be barking and nipping at her, not to mention her grandmother. What would the old woman be like today? Then, of course, Tina would get that message from school. It would be nice, at least, if she didn't have to deal with that mean little dog. Jasper reminded her of Marcy. Always yipping at her, she prayed the dog would just run away. A shudder ran through her body as Janet looked up at the house. Letting out a defeated sigh, she walked up the front steps. Turning the knob, she spoke. "Leave me alone, you little turd. Just go away." Entering, the house was quiet. No Jasper. Maybe the little pain in the butt was sleeping. Unobstructed, Janet headed to the kitchen and downed not one, but 2 sodas in rapid succession. She figured she deserved them after today. Looking around, something seemed off about the kitchen. Something Janet couldn't put her finger on. She shrugged. Maybe her aunt had cleaned it or something. Janet headed upstairs. The quiet was starting to unnerve her. She hadn't noticed if the car was in the driveway. Maybe Tina had taken Graham to a doctor's appointment. They moved the old woman's room downstairs once she'd been confined to a wheelchair. She generally stayed away from her grandmother's room. The smell of it bothered her. On the second floor, she went to her aunt's room. Tina was busy dusting off her dresser. There was an assortment of knickknacks, jewelry, and photos covering its surface. Janet lightly knocked on the open door. The woman turned and smiled at her. "Is everything okay?" Janet asked. Tina frowned. "Yes, honey, why?" "It's just so quiet." "Well, your grandmother is taking a little afternoon nap." "Jasper taking a nap with her?" Tina tilted her head, a perplexed look etched on her face. "Who's Jasper, honey?" "Graham's mean little dog, always barking." Tina shook her head. "Your grandmother's never had a dog." Was it possible? Had she made the dog disappear? No, the strange woman on the screen, the apparition in the hall, she'd done it. She'd said she could help Janet. Why did that woman's face feel so familiar? A sudden realization hit the girl. Janet looked at the photos on her aunt's dresser. There were pictures of Aunt Tina, her grandmother, and of her, but none of her mother or father. In fact, try as she might, Janet couldn't recall what her parents looked like. She felt light as a feather as her room, no, the whole house, spun about her. For a second she could see something else. The bits that formed the universe, that made up everyone and everything. It suddenly became too much, and she passed out. When Janet woke, she was lying in darkness, barely able to make out the faintest details of her room in the dark. She sat up straight upon seeing the woman standing at the foot of her bed. The woman reached out with an open hand. "Are you my mother?" Janet asked. The woman merely smiled, filling Janet with an overwhelming sense of peace. Without hesitation, she reached out. The woman took her hand, and Janet felt oneness. An instant later, morning sun spilled in through the windows. She was alone, the woman nowhere to be seen. The past few days seemed nothing more than a distant, half-forgotten dream. From downstairs came the delicious smell of bacon, scrambled eggs, and hash browns. Hurrying down to the dining room, Janet found the table set for 4. "Well, someone's bright and bushy-tailed this morning." A man stood in the door leading to the kitchen. A pipe in one hand, large Coke bottle glasses hung down on his nose. Janet knew this man. "Dad?" "Who else, honey?" "Where did you come from?" What kind of question is that? Where did I come from? I've always been here. We've always been here." The woman from the hall entered holding a large plate of bacon, followed by her Aunt Tina. Janet smiled. She could feel the world was as it should be. Things had been corrected, and she'd fixed them. When she went to school today, she'd fix that. Fix Marcy, too. The world flowed around her. She could feel every speck of it, and how it related to every other speck. In fact, there was another world beyond this one. Perhaps she'd visit that world soon. The monitor beeped, waking Professor Rogers from a dream. He looked at the large computer monitor. Everything appeared in order. All the lights were green. He glanced over at the sleeping girl. A strange device was hooked to her head. Wire ran from it to the computer behind her bed. For all the world, it looked like the tiara a princess would wear. His princess. There was a light rap at the door. It was his assistant, Johnson. "Sorry to disturb you, sir." "Anything wrong? I must admit I dozed off for a little bit." "No, sir, not really. There was a strange echo in there for a while. Then it faded. Your daughter's mind appears to be adapting to the simulation." Rogers rubbed his bloodshot eyes. Good. You should get some sleep. The couch in the break room isn't that bad, really." He nodded. "Actually, that sounds good." He stretched as he took one last look at his comatose daughter. He'd lost his wife in that car accident. He wouldn't lose his daughter, no matter what. "It's a good thing you're doing, sir," Johnson said. This could help so many others, like your Janet." And after they left, the monitor flickered as a face began to take shape.
I know what you're thinking. It's especially terrifying when you consider that you're probably listening to this on a smartphone or some kind of Amazon device or your home computer. Ghosts in the machine are a real concern, especially at Halloween time. But we have another story for you that changes gears a bit. This time, we head out to the woods for a relaxing camping weekend by a body of water where something or someone may be lurking in the depths, hoping that you hear their song, hoping that you come to them, down to their watery grave. So get comfortable for this real scary one after a quick word from our sponsors.
The Siren's Song by Joe Salmo. Jacob looked out over the river as it cut its way through the rolling hills of the southern Adirondack Range in New York. He hated to admit it, but just the view made him feel better, a little. He heard the old rusty door slam behind him and his uncle's footsteps approach. "Let's get settled in. Then we'll head out and catch us some dinner, eh, boy?" Uncle Glenn said as he messed up Jacob's hair. "The fresh air will do you good." Jacob watched as his uncle headed towards the rustic one-room cabin that sat on the riverbank. He wondered how he was supposed to enjoy himself up here with his uncle. It had only been 3 days since his mother's funeral. A car accident took her from him. She was on her way to pick him up from a friend's house after a night of trying out Dungeons and Dragons. The night was fun. He was all smiles until the phone rang at Keith's house, and Keith's mom had to drive him home. She wouldn't explain why, but Jacob could tell by the look on her face something was wrong. They never caught the person who crossed the double yellow lines and hit his mother head on. They fled the stolen car and the scene on foot before the police arrived and found her there. Jacob overheard the officer say that she was still alive when they arrived, but passed shortly after. They found several beer cans in the other car and thought it might have been a drunk or teens out for a joyride, but no one knew for sure. There was no justice, just loss. It really wasn't fair. When Uncle Greg showed up to help them with the arrangements and daily household stuff, Jacob was glad. His father seemed lost. He'd just stare out the window at the driveway, like he expected his wife to pull in any minute. At times, Jacob wanted to join him, wanted to believe that it was all a mistake, and his mother would be home in time for dinner and complain about how his father overcooked the roast. The night after the funeral, his father suggested he go to bed early. And to be honest, Jacob didn't feel like staying up. As he finished brushing his teeth, he could hear his uncle and father talking on the back deck. The window was open on the warm August night. He dragged the stool over to the window he used to brush his teeth so he could peek out. His father was still wearing his white shirt and tie, the latter hanging loosely to his side. His father raised a glass to his lips. He turned towards Glenn. "You know why I don't want to go back up there," Jacob's father said after swallowing. "It would do the both of you good to get away. Come up to the river camp. It'll be like old times, Jason," Glenn replied. "The boy should be up there too. Get away from this place." "Too many memories. Memories of her. You know, not all the memories up there were good ones," Jason said. They sat in silence for a minute, and Jacob got bored. He climbed down and put his wooden stool away. He thought it was odd that his father told his uncle that he met Mom at the cabin. When he'd asked for a school project, his parents told him that they met at a school dance. Jacob snapped out of his memory and looked at the river as it flowed by. So this was where his father and mother met. He looked up and down the shore and wondered which of the houses had belonged to his mother's family. He'd never met anyone from his mother's side. She told him that they had all died when she was young. Before he knew it, he was standing at the water's edge. Something had drawn him there. There was something comforting about the way the water lazily passed by the large boulder near the weathered dock. He walked out onto the aged wooden planks until he reached the edge and looked down at the reflection of the sunset and mountains in the river. He stared intensely into the water. There was something there, just under the surface, but he couldn't make it out. Pastels reminiscent of Easter covering the swirling water, keeping its underwater secrets from him. He slapped a mosquito as it tried to make a meal of him. A look out on the water showed all kinds of insects swimming just above the surface of the water, and he regretted not bringing a long-sleeve shirt to cover up. Jacob had never been fishing before. He wondered if he'd like it. Maybe if it was a video game. Then he wouldn't have to worry about the bugs. "There you are, Jake," came Uncle Greg's voice from behind him. "Let's get all the bags inside. It's really cooling down. The browns should be out soon." Jacob didn't know what a brown was. He assumed it was some kind of fish, or maybe an insect, since there were so many of those out. He grabbed his duffel bag from the back of the truck, and with a grunt lifted it over the side of the truck. It took both hands to carry it to the house with a week's worth of clothes inside. "What's a brown?" he asked his uncle, as he caught up to him, out of breath. "Trout, boy. Brown trout. It's on the menu for tonight. They love to eat those bugs there and will be right up near the surface. Easy pickings," Uncle Greg replied. "Ew, they eat bugs?" Jacob asked. "Sure do. It's a source of protein for them." "Do they taste like bugs when you eat them?" asked Jacob. "Not at all. They're delicious," his uncle replied with a laugh and put his bag down on the old worn couch. "You take the bed. I'll take the couch." Jacob looked at the bed by the window. It had a nice view of the river. He carried his bag over to the bed and plopped in there without taking his eyes off the river. A boat was heading upriver. The steady drone of its motor was almost trance-like. He watched it until it was out of sight. "How come you don't have a motorboat like that, Uncle Glenn?" Jacob asked. "Well, honestly, I can't afford one. I'm not very good with money," Glenn said, laughing as he set down the cooler by the old sink. Jacob had not even seen his uncle go back out to the truck to get the cooler. "Dad says you whiz it away, but I don't know what that means," Jacob said. "Yeah, well, when we were growing up, your father had it easier than I did making friends. I found my friend in a bottle. You understand?" Uncle Glenn asked, gathering up the fishing gear and heading towards the door. "Yeah," Jacob said, but had no idea what his uncle was talking about. The canoe was so shaky, it felt like if Jacob sneezed he would send the thing over, and he'd have to swim back to the cabin. So he sat, very still, white-knuckle gripping the sides of the aluminum canoe in order to prevent his imaginary catastrophe. His uncle paddled them upriver a bit to a spot he said he knew where there was a deep pool that the browns liked to hang out in. They would drift with the current from above it so the fish wouldn't hear the splashing of the oars and get spooked. Even though he was terrified of the canoe tipping, Jacob wasn't afraid of the river itself. Once again, he felt a calmness when he looked out on it. There was something familiar about the river. Something comforting. It took a few minutes for him to get up the nerve to let go of one side of the canoe and reach down to the water, letting his fingers drag in the cool water. "Well, here we are," his uncle said, and slid the canoe just upstream of a fallen log to keep the watercraft in place. "You ready to catch some fish?" Jacob watched his uncle take a rod out from a tube and fit the ends together until the thing was almost as long as the canoe. He had seen rods in fishing shows before, but this one was super long, and the line was brightly colored. He watched as his uncle tied a tiny little poofy thing to the end. "Here, take this," Glenn said, thrusting the rod towards his nephew. Jacob reached out slowly to take the rod from his uncle, daring to rise a little from his safely seated position. As he sat back down, he felt something bump the canoe. "What was that?" he asked nervously, looking around wide-eyed. "We just brushed up against a log. Nothing to worry about," his uncle said, and started to fit together another rod. "All I have are these fly fishing rods. It's a little harder to cast, but the browns love the flies on the end." his uncle explained, and stood up in the canoe, making it shake more than Jacob would have liked. Uncle Glenn gave a false cast and sent the line shooting out the end upstream. Jacob watched the graceful cast. It was easy to see the bright orange line make its way back downriver to them. His uncle cast this way 3 more times, explaining to Jacob how it worked. But Jacob wasn't about to stand up in the boat now. He felt another bump on the canoe. This time he swore he felt something tapping on the bottom of the boat. "What is that?" Jacob asked, terrified. "There are all kinds of noises, kid. It could be anything, a branch, a turtle, nothing to worry about either way," Uncle Glenn explained, and sat back down in the canoe. He reached into the bag he brought with them and pulled out a beer. "If you were another year older, I'd let you have one, but 11 is just too young to drink a beer." "That's okay. I don't want to drink," Jacob said. "Good boy. Don't end up like me," his uncle answered, putting down the beer to grab his paddle. "Let's move a little farther downstream and give it another go." Jacob nodded and looked overboard as his uncle maneuvered them out into the current to take them downstream. Jacob, can you hear me?" His young eyes widened as he heard the familiar voice. It couldn't be. How could he hear his mother? She was dead. He looked at his uncle to see if he heard it too, but he just guided the canoe down the river. "Jacob, it's your mother. Can you hear me, child?" Jacob tried to swallow, but his throat went dry. The hairs on his neck stood up. This can't be happening. Uncle Glenn, I don't feel so good. Can we just go back to the cabin?" Jacob asked in a weak voice. "Huh? Oh, I guess we could. Didn't know you get seasick. Our family have been sailors for generations. Must be from your mother's side. I never met her folks. Probably grew up landlocked," his uncle said. "Let's break down these rods first." Another thump on the boat, this one louder. Jacob wondered if he was losing his mind. Between the thumps and hearing his mother's voice, he just wanted to go home, get away from the crazy place. He looked out on the water and no longer felt a calming sensation. He was terrified. "Jacob, I need your help. You will help your mother, won't you?" He closed his eyes tight, wishing it all away. The voice, the bumps, the trip, the accident, everything. Why was this happening to him? Why was his mother taken from him? Was that really her voice he heard? Was it all in his head? They reached the dock without further incident, then entered the cabin without another word. Jacob went over to the bed and lay on it, facing the river. He didn't want to turn his back on it. You want something to eat?" his uncle asked from the small table where he was sitting. "No thanks. I'm not very hungry," Jacob replied, propping his head up on his pillow to better see out the window. He wondered why he didn't see more boats on the river. Sure, it was getting dark now, but still there wasn't much traffic out there. "Okay, maybe you'll feel like eating in the morning. I'll make pancakes. If you need anything, just let me know. I'll be having a few drinks before I turn in, I think," his uncle replied. Jacob closed his eyes for a second, then looked back towards the water. He closed them again, longer this time, trying to fall asleep and put an end to this day. One less day he had to stay here, and he could go home. He wasn't sure how long he'd slept, but when he woke, it was dark out. He could hear his uncle snoring from the other side of the cabin. He sat up and looked out the window, the full moon illuminating the scene before him. He could make out the dock on the shore of the river, a ribbon of darkness flowing in the moonlight. Jacob, are you there?" The voice again. How? Jacob wrapped the blanket around him. Wait, what was that? "Jacob, don't be afraid." The hair on the back of his neck stood up again as his brain processed what his eyes were seeing. A woman was coming out of the lake, wrapped in a white dress, flowing behind her. It couldn't be, could it? "Mom?" "Yes, my son. It's me. Come outside. I will explain everything." Jacob looked at his uncle, passed out sitting at the table now covered with empty cans. He would sleep through the night. He slipped out of bed, keeping the blanket wrapped around him, as he made it to the door. He opened the wooden door just enough so that he could slip out, sure to close it, quietly, behind him. He made his way through the damp grass, keeping his eyes locked on his mother on the river's edge. He noticed a swirl of fog obscuring her legs and feet as he approached. She reached out to him, but he stopped 20 feet shy. He looked at her pale face, surrounded by her fire-red hair. It didn't look wet, even though she seemingly emerged from the river. I guess anything is possible in a dream, he thought. Jacob, why do you hesitate? Come here, son. Her voice sang in his ears, but her lips never moved. Was this a dream? Mom? Is it really you? He asked. It's me, Jake. Did you hear me earlier on the river? Yes. Was that you thumping on the boat? He asked her, pulling the blanket tighter around him. The night was colder than he realized. Yes. I was trying to get your attention, son. I miss you and your father so much. I didn't expect to be back here so soon. Why are you here at the river? Is the river... Jacob asked. No, Jake. This is where I came from. I had to return when I was done with my life with you. It is complicated. Are you a ghost? Her musical laughter filled his ears. My child, that is a good question. I'm not sure, to be honest. I have been keeping a secret from you for years. I think it's time to tell you of your heritage, my son. But first, I need to ask you a favor. Jacob woke from his uncle shaking him. Are you okay, Jacob? It's almost 9, his uncle said. 5 more minutes, Jacob grumbled, rolling back over. Okay, Jake, I'll get started on breakfast then, his uncle said. Pancakes good? The grunt his uncle heard from the pile of blankets he took as an affirmative. Soon the smell of bacon and maple syrup assaulted Jacob's nose. He rose from the blankets and looked out at the river, remembering what his mother told him last night. It had to have been a dream, he thought. It had seemed so real, though. Jacob had to admit he was really hungry and his mouth watered when he saw breakfast on the table. He ate so many pancakes he thought he was going to burst. He wondered if there was a more perfect food. If there was, he hadn't had it. That was for sure. Can we go fishing again tonight? Jacob asked. Sure. Didn't think you'd want to go after getting seasick last night. We can go right now if you want. Just let me finish the dishes, Uncle Glenn said. No, let's wait until tonight. It will be cooler. Teach me to cast like you did last night in the yard, though. It looked fun, like a whip, Jacob said, throwing his napkin in the trash. It's not really like a whip at all, but I'll show you. Can you check on our ice situation? Do I need to run into town? His uncle asked. Jacob opened up the cooler. It looks like we might need some for later. What happened to all the beer that was in there? His uncle looked in the cooler. I guess I had a few more than I thought. A trip into town it is then. Do you want to go with me or hang out here? I'll stay here, Uncle Glenn, Jacob replied. I want to draw a little, he said, and went for his duffel bag. Inside was a sketchbook and pencils. He pulled them out and brought them to the table. Suit yourself, I won't be long, Uncle Glenn said, and headed out the door. Jacob sighed as his uncle left. Could it be true? His uncle returned hours later. It was mid-afternoon, and he smelled of alcohol. Bad. Jacob couldn't get within 10 feet of him. He reeked. Come on, boy. Time to teach you to cast like a master, his uncle said, and grabbed the tubes that contained the rods they used last night. Jacob. A chill went down his spine as he stood in the yard. Was his mother really calling to him? "Jacob, I can't get any closer. Are we set for tonight?" Jacob nodded towards the river. He didn't know if she could hear him or not, but the nod seemed to answer her question. "Thank you, my son. See you at sunset." "You always just stare off into space, boy?" his uncle asked, scratching his head. "You weren't watching. Now pay attention." An hour later, Uncle Glenn was passed out on the porch, and Jacob had the rest of the night to himself. He would wake his uncle when it was time to fish. Jacob managed to get his uncle up just before sunset and get him into the canoe. He even helped paddle this time. They made their way upriver even faster than the night before, and passed the fallen log even earlier. "Let's try a little further upriver," Jacob said. "Is that okay, Uncle Glenn?" "Sure, boy. Keep paddling. I'll get the rods ready." Jacob continued to paddle upriver, pushing against the current. The sun was beginning to drop behind the mountains, similar to last night when they were out here. "Is this a good spot?" Jacob asked. "Good as any to start," his uncle replied, and threw the little anchor overboard to keep them in the same spot long enough to fish. He handed Jacob a rod and grabbed one for himself. "Go ahead. Give it a cast." Jacob hesitated. "You go first. I want to watch you cast one more time." He felt something against the bottom of the boat. Was that a thump? Glenn cast out towards the shore, where there was a bend in the river, the insects swarming just above the surface. He felt something and tried to set the hook, but lost it. He stood in the canoe, making it wobble until he got himself balanced. "Are you ready now, Jacob?" "I need a little more distance," Uncle Glenn said, and cast again. This time, his fly landed inches from the bank. "That's the sweet spot right there," he said, and began to strip the line. "Now, Jacob, just like we talked about." Jacob picked up the tube that the rods came in. It was made of fiberglass, not very heavy, but it would have to do. He slid forward in the canoe, slowly, until he was near his uncle. "Uncle Glenn?" "What is it, boy? Don't you know you have to be quiet when fishing?" "This is from Mom," Jacob said, and swung the tube into his uncle's gut, catching him unaware. His uncle pitched forward and the canoe began to twist towards shore. What did you do that for?" his uncle growled, clutching his belly. Jacob answered him with another swing, this one right behind the knees, causing his uncle's legs to buckle. He fell back and went overboard. The canoe stayed upright, just like his mother promised him it would, like it was held in place. "Help me out of the damn water," his uncle called out, grabbing the side of the canoe and shaking it. Pale arms reached up from behind Glenn and snaked around him. "Good job, my son. He must pay for what he did to me. He was jealous of your father and I. And when I turned him down, he decided if he couldn't have me, no one could. First, he kidnapped me from the river onto dry land with my newborn fry, you. Then, your father and Glenn fought over me, like some kind of prize. When I died, my soul went back to the river where my people live. Where your people live, Jacob." Jacob listened to the explanation from his mother as her face came up next to his uncle's. A large flipper slapped the water as she dragged his uncle farther from the canoe. "We have avenged my death, son. Now we must avenge our kidnapping from our people. Paddle back and call your father up here. Then we can be together again. Then I can teach you about your heritage. I can show you how to change your form, to live in the water or on land." Jacob paddled away as he heard his uncle splashing behind him, crying out for help. He wouldn't look back, not after what his uncle and father had done to his mother. No wonder she was so sad all the time, he thought. He put the paddle across his lap and let the current take him back to the cabin now that the waters behind him have gone silent. Soon, he would be reunited with his people, under the river. Just one more wrong to right.
Well, it's getting late, and I suppose we're almost out of time. But we have one more truly terrifying story for you. And this one takes us out of the fall season, away from winter, back to summer. Summer camp, to be more specific. This story is all about the fun goings-on at a summer camp being turned on top of their heads by a strange and dangerous man who lives on the other side of the lake. This one I really enjoy, and I know you will too. So give it a listen, and please make sure you're subscribed to our show, because when Halloween ends, we don't. We go on and on every single week. In fact, we have not missed a single week in 3 years, and we have no intention of starting now. So enjoy the story, but make sure you really research the summer camps you send your children to, because sometimes camp can be killer. So enjoy the story after a quick word from our sponsors.
Summer Slaycation by David O'Hanlon. The plan is simple, Henry Stout said around the butt of his cigarette. We take the canoes across the lake and into the cypress maze, and then it's just a short hike to the Miniwinion bunkhouses. What if we get lost? Lance Calaveras snatched the smoke from Henry's mouth. It's called the maze for a reason. Henry scratched at the patch of bristly hair he called his beard. I've done the maze 3 times. I can get us through. Henry was on his 4th stay at the Living Grace Rehabilitation Camp for youth offenders. The 13-week camp was developed by Pastor Frank Oppendecker to put kids on the straight and narrow through Christ. If that didn't work, the former Marine Corps drill instructor had more inventive ways to grind the little pukes into productive members of society. The Cypress Maze was the final test for all the teens that entered the program. If they failed, they completed their sentences in a juvenile detention center. It was a one-time deal. Normally, Father O, as the delinquents called him, took a special interest in Henry and brought him back every time he reoffended. He saw Henry as the camp's one and only failure. Henry saw the camp as a grueling but welcomed reprieve from his home, a dilapidated trailer park outside of Russellville called the Green Mile. Yeah, you've done the maze, Lance said, but not at night. Then stay here, Henry threw his hands in the air. Maybe Father O will let you polish the pews for morning service. The rest of us are going to the Miniwinions. And then we'll see. Ted Vang cupped both his hands to his chest, as if cradling breasts. Seriously, Ted? Dexter Brown shook his head. With those glasses, you can see them from here. Too many trees in the way. Ted adjusted his glasses over his plump cheeks. Ted's right, Henry smirked. The senior house is responsible for bed checks and lockdown, so they hit the showers last. That's when we'll strike. We throw the bombs through the windows, and they'll all come out running. Dexter held up the Polaroid camera. And I'll get the photos to make sure we all get a good look and don't miss out on anything. What about the counselors? Jimmy O'Reilly, always the pragmatist, asked. They're going to come running too. These babies aren't exactly subtle. Jimmy tossed one of the devices between his hands. It wasn't much bigger than a thermos, with a main body of papier-mâché over chicken wire with 4 thinner cardboard tubes attached to the sides. A waterproof fuse snaked from the top of all 4 and came together in a braid with that of the main device. The entire package was wrapped in black electrical tape for easy concealment on the moonless night. Jimmy's unsettling interest in things that went boom were what landed him in the camp. Spaz will take care of that, Henry reassured them. Marco Spaz Reynolds tugged at the ends of his shaggy mane and rocked in place, giggling. Yeah, I got something to keep those pesky counselors out of our business. Father O handpicked all the campers. He wanted to challenge himself as much as the youths. Whether it be Henry's seeming inability to rehabilitate, Ted's obesity, Dexter's unwillingness to apply his genius IQ, Jimmy's authority issues, or Lance's temper, each of the 6 teens offered him a chance to prove his faith. Spaz was no different. He grew up in a satanic cult that were currently all facing charges of kidnapping and cannibalism. There was no evidence that Spaz had been involved in the cult's crimes, but it didn't matter. He was still a devout devil worshipper. The raised flesh of a pentagram branded on his forehead made Spaz a poster child for the program, if Father O could reform him. "Okay," Lance said, "let's stop talking about it and get moving." He grabbed one of Jimmy's devices. "No one gets hurt, right?" "Maybe their feelings," Jimmy shrugged. "It's all smoke and sparks and some little pops, just enough to make them think there's a fire." The 6 boys made their way to the door of the cabin, and Dexter poked his head out first. The pastor's cabin was dark in the distance, opposite the oppressive structures of the obstacle course. Dexter nodded the all clear, and they eased through the screen door one after the other, careful not to let the rusted spring slam it shut. The rubber band of Ted's slingshot twanged softly, followed by the unavoidable pop of a light bulb shattering. Jimmy stretched his neck to watch over the bush for Father O's lamp to come on. When it didn't, he tapped Ted's shoulder. The portly Mongolian fired another stone at the second light positioned over the rack of canoes. Shards tinkled off the fiberglass bodies of the little boats. The boys sprinted across the open lot and quickly loosed 3 of the canoes. They carried them overhead just like the pastor made them on their morning marches. The boats hit water, and the teens paddled gently into the lake. On the other side of the lake, the lovely ladies of the Miniwinion Girls' Retreat would be working diligently to finish their nightly duties. Then they would head to the showers. Their bare flesh was a siren song sang between the horrid cries of frogs, crickets, and cicadas. The 6 boys increased their rowing without saying a word. They were at the mercy of their loins, which spurred them faster into the low fog that shrouded the mouth of the cypress maze. Spaz held the narrow trunk of a smaller cypress to keep the canoe still as Jimmy urinated over the aft. Henry and Ted shared the lead boat and panned their flashlights around wildly. Lance and Dexter rowed past them and deeper into the maze. "Glad you know the way, Henry," Lance said. "This is the right way," Henry responded. "I marked the trees the last time I went through the stupid thing. We already made it to the second marker, which means the third should be right here. That's the halfway point." "You've been looking for the mark for 20 minutes, Dexter reminded him. "The girls will already be dried off by the time we get there." "They'll still be naked, though," Ted reassured them all. A sudden splash broke up their debate and was immediately followed by a profane cry and another dynamic entrance into the marsh. The 4 teens turned their lights in the direction of the commotion. The red bottom of the canoe was facing up and rocking in the turbulence. The lights danced over the surface of the water and converged on the face-down body that drifted away from the boat, lazily. "Oh, damn!" Dexter went to work with his oar, rowing them backwards. "Hold on, Jimmy, we're coming." The canoe must have come down on him when it flipped. Lance rowed harder and panned his head-mounted light wildly. "Where's Spaz?" "Get him out of the water!" Henry twisted in his seat. "There's gators out there." "Why are we out here in the dark if there's gators?" Ted gripped his oar like a spear and gazed at the black void around them. "They hunt at night." Lots of things hunt at night. The bank of halogen lights illuminated the teens and everything in a 60-foot path. Dexter pulled Jimmy's unconscious body across the canoe. Behind the glare of the bulbs, a silhouette stalked across the deck of a camouflaged airboat. The form of some strange malevolence moved behind him and slipped over the side, disappearing into the water. Ted stood quickly, swinging the paddle over his shoulder like a club. "Who are you?" Ted took a step back, rocking the boat hard. Henry leaned forward to the other side to steady them. "Get out of here, mister. Our counselor's out here with us." "The good pastor is sound asleep," the shadowy figure said. "Don't struggle too much. I don't want you hurting yourself." Something broke the surface beside Lance and Dexter. A pair of malformed green-brown appendages reached up and twisted in Jimmy's clothing. His body slipped back into the marsh. Dexter and Lance grabbed his legs and struggled to pull him back in. The tug-of-war intensified with the heavy rocking of the canoe. Jimmy's legs were completely submerged, then up to his ribcage. Suddenly, the boys were airborne. They popped their heads above the filthy water, coughing and rubbing their eyes clear. Jimmy bobbed beside them. They reached for him in unison. They screamed that way, too. when the bisected body of their bunkmate tipped over and sank into the abyss. Dexter watched in horror as Ted and Henry were knocked into the marsh. A net sailed from the airboat over them, and something beneath the surface gathered it, dragging it back to the man hiding behind the lights. Lance disappeared with a quick splash. Dexter swam as hard as he could. He didn't care if he was swimming toward camp or the Mississippi, just so long as he was swimming anywhere that wasn't the cypress maze. Something snagged his shirt. He felt the barbs dragging through his flesh, but forced himself onward. Then, he was underwater. And he wasn't alone. The house sat on a tiny island in the back of the bayou away from prying eyes. Sawgrass obscured the boundaries where land met swamp and the tiny dock at which the airboat rocked sedately. The ramshackle 3-story was built shortly after the Civil War and abandoned for almost as long. Portions of the roof sagged, and others had collapsed long before and were patched with tarps. Glass was long gone from the windows, and the breeze whistled across the edges of the century-old shards that remained. 2 rusted water tanks had been converted to hold gasoline for the generators, and 3 windmills provided the rest of his electricity. The owner stretched his aching limbs. The isolated home was the perfect location for the laboratory and the clandestine aims of his research. It was not so easy on his ailing body, however. He wrung his arthritic hands and worked the blue nitrile gloves over them with a pair of sharp snaps. He checked his reflection in a grimy mirror. Its surface shook with the constant rumbling of the generators. He'd forgotten surgical masks on his last trek into town. Not that it would matter once the procedure was complete. He adjusted the paper cap over the few remaining patches of vomit-yellow hair and the unfortunate results of the last treatment. He would succeed soon. It was a shame the one boy was torn in half, but science came with losses. No one cared how many monkeys got vivisected in the name of medical advancement. Teenage boys were just as abundant and equally expendable. One of them was advancing at an exponential rate already. The previous summer's campers were failures, but they did get him closer to his goals, and he was certain that this was his year. He wiggled a tooth in its socket with his tongue. It clacked off the floorboards next to his feet. If he didn't succeed this year, there wouldn't be enough left of him for another harvest. He padded up the stairs, feeling each step rattling his fragile bones. The boy in the suspension tube was showing amazing cellular response. The other had not been so compatible. The doctor watched 2 of his previous failures dragging the corpse to the window to push it over the sill. A splash let him know they'd made their shot. The 2 creatures slapped each other's backs wildly and screeched with excitement. Baboons were so easily pleased, even ones that weren't entirely monkey anymore. The 3 remaining teens awaited their first rounds of injections on the reclined gurneys that served as surgical tables. The chubby Asian boy was sobbing while the other 2 observed the room quietly. The doctor found their calm unsettling and busied himself with turning up the isotope saturation of the suspension tube. The disfigured teen floated in the irradiated solution beneath the glow of ultraviolet lamps that shimmered between the lily pads floating at the top of the tube. The doctor tapped the glass until the boy's eyes opened. "You are a marvelous creature," the doctor said. His 2 servants bounded closer to him. Leaves pressed through their green-gray hairs with coiling vines dangling from their aged faces like unkempt beards. They were his first successes and his only companions. The doctor patted their heads. "Go feed your siblings. They may not be necessary after tonight." He leaned in and kissed the suspension tube. "We may finally have what we need." Frank Oppendecker dragged the inflatable boat onto the island's shore. His boys were missing, and there were 2 places they could go. With no disturbances at the Mini-Winion camp, that only left the creepy house in the middle of the swamp. Something splashed behind him, and he cocked the shotgun slide to remind the mysterious owner to stay away. It did. Father O crept through the house, thankful for the drone of the generators masking his creaking ascent to the 2nd floor. He pressed the walnut stock of his weapon tight into his shoulder and swiveled around the doorway into the lab. 3 of his campers were strapped down. Another man stood with the back of a filthy lab coat turned toward Father O. He inched into the room, scanning the abundance of shadows left by the inadequate illumination of the strands of Christmas lights overhead. Lance's face stretched into a smile as he saw the pastor coming in to save them. He quickly wiped the look away before the doctor could see it. "Where are the others?" Father Rowe asked. The doctor turned slowly. Warped earthen tendrils stretched from corrupted flesh and wiggled in the air. Beneath the lab coat was nothing but liver spots and deep purple veins broken up by the abominations of the doctor's self-experimentation. Tiny leaves sprang where normal men grew hair, and bright red flowers opened to sniff the air. "You never come to visit anymore, Francis." The doctor ambled closer to Father Rowe with his arms outstretched. "I mean it, Dad. You can't take all of them." Frank lowered his weapon. "I thought your experiments were running amok again. I should have known it was your gluttonous zeal for this blasphemous perversion." "Dad?" Dexter tried to sit up, but the straps binding him to the table just turned it into an awkward twitch. "Father Rowe, what's he talking about?" The pastor ignored him. The doctor pinched the embroidered pocket of his coat and wiggled it in the direction of Dexter. "Dr. Werner Oppendecker. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself sooner." Werner turned to his son. "Does it make life easier, Francis, going through it blindly accepting magic instead of reaching for obtainable knowledge in the realms of science?" "Save me the Thanksgiving disappointment debate, Dad. Cut them loose." He jerked a thumb toward the suspension tube. "You can keep that one, but these 3 are going with me. Where are the other 2? "Dead, I'm afraid. And you're not taking my subjects. I'm too close this time, Francis. I've destroyed my cancers, though with unfortunate side effects. These hooligans that you brought me will take the procedure to a level that will end all human suffering." "Human?" Lance grunted. "Humans don't grow lilies on their skin, you nutjob. You're not human." "And our ancestors were not apes." Werner turned, and the woody tendrils reached out to caress Lance's face. "They were more, and so shall we be. I am no longer just a man." Werner twisted away, letting the appendages scratch Lance's cheeks as he made his way to the tube. He slapped the glass. "Evolution is an undeniable reality, and I have harnessed it. Human and plant will come together to create a human that never ages and is immune to all of our horrible diseases." "Meat and veggies all in one dish?" Dexter said. "Sounds pretty crazy to me. Don't you think so, Ted?" Ted cried louder in response. "I think he agrees," Lance said. "I'm not screwing around, Dad." Father Rowe raised the shotgun to his hip. "I'm taking the boys back with me." "I knew you'd say that." Werner smiled as best he could with so few teeth remaining. "You should have paid more attention in school, son. Plants communicate. With pheromones." The floor collapsed under him and the shotgun boomed as he fell through. The shrieks of the 2 baboons mingled with Father Rowe's screams until they were the only sound remaining. Lance stared at the mad scientist clutching the tight cluster of buckshot holes in his abdomen before he toppled over. Werner's face splashed into the pool of water streaming from the holes in the blood-splattered suspension tube. The glass spiderwebbed around them. Fissures raced along the surface until the weight of the fluid tore the pieces away in a fantastic crash of falling glass and rushing water. He struggled to get a hand free of the straps while the mad scientist screamed at the disaster. Success. Lance quickly undid the buckles across his torso and proceeded to free Dexter. They worked in tandem to release Ted, who immediately curled into a fetal position. "I want to wake up, now," he cried. "I'm sorry I tried to look at the girls. I just want to wake up." "We don't have time for this." Lance slapped Ted's cheek with no result aside from a raised handprint. "Come on, Ted. We have to run, now." "Better idea." Dexter kicked the brakes on the gurney's wheels. "That works. Now let's get out of here." They pushed Ted toward the doorway as fast as the rusted, squealing wheels would roll. One of the plant monkeys sprang through the hole in the floor and blocked their path. Its mossy-covered lips peeled away from piercing fangs. Lance slid like he was stealing home base and kicked it back into the hole. The creature's terrified shriek was replaced with Lance's own as gnarled root-like fangs dug into his leg. The second beast emerged from broken floorboards. Tiny buds bloomed among its stiff hairs, revealing snapping floral mouths full of adhesive fuchsia fingers. Even the plant-based parts of the monstrosity hungered for flesh. It launched itself out of the hole and straddled him. The creature tried to pulp Lance's skull and narrowly missed. Dexter seized it by the thick coat of its back, only to be attacked by the miniature mouths hiding there. The plants tore into his hands and held him tight while the baboon's jaws snapped inches from Lance's throat. A horrible, chaotic orchestra of howls, shrieks, and unintelligible shouting played below their battle. "I'm sorry, guys." Ted Vang rolled from his stretcher and darted for the window. "I just wanted to see boobs." The towering green form lumbered across his path. Twisting vines of inching-long thorns hung like living dreadlocks around its verdant face. Scales of bark sprouted along the angular jaw, and, in the center of the thing's forehead, was the raised lines of a pentagram. Ted held his arms up defensively. "Spaz? Is that you? It's Ted. We're friends. Right, bud?" "Right," Spaz hissed, before his new hair ensnared the portly camper. Spaz's chest opened with a sticky slurp and he jerked Ted into the maw head first. Spaz snapped around to the remaining campers as they fought with the baboon. He stomped toward the fray. Things just got worse. Dexter slammed a knee into the monkey's tailbone and tore a hand free. Lance held the creature's jaws apart with his face caught between them. "Not from down here, they haven't. Kill this stupid thing!" Spaz's foot connected with Dexter and sent him and the abomination thudding into the wall. "Shit," Lance stared up at Spaz. Things just got worse. Lance rolled away as the thorns scoured the floor in a vain effort to seize him. He pulled the gurney between him and Spaz. Ted's legs kicked soundlessly as his head and torso dissolved inside Spaz's new form. The man-plant's lips contorted in malevolent joy. "I've always enjoyed the taste of human," it growled. "Yeah, well, I've always hated vegetables." Lance grabbed Ted's leg and jumped down the hole. Spaz caught himself on the broken boards and Lance dangled from the leg of his slowly digesting fellow camper. The first floor was a demolition site. The busted cages lined the walls. Malformed freaks ran amok, tearing apart the home and each other. Father O, what was left of him, limped through the madness, freeing more of the doctor's failed experiments. Lance dropped the rest of the distance and picked himself up with a groan. Something that might have been a raccoon snarled at him, and he booted it across the room. Its mossy body bounced next to Father O's shotgun. Spaz came crashing down beside him, with Dexter on his back. The teen winked at Lance, and then jumped off the writhing beast. "Let's get out of here," Dexter said as he ran for the door. "Detour first." Lance dashed for the weapon and joined him on the front porch. They watched some of the creatures swim away from the tiny island. Others simply disappeared beneath the placid surface of the swamp. Lance twisted and saw the oblong, rust-covered tanks next to the house. He raised the shotgun and fired it until it clicked on the empty chamber. Gasoline spurted from the wounds, but the tanks didn't explode. Dexter raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "It's the thought that counts." "It always works in the movies," Lance pointed at the airboat. "Let's go." The two teens untied from the mooring and turned on the motor, watching the oversized fan spin without any sort of guard. The doctor cared as much for safety as he did for medical ethics, it seemed. Dexter laughed and held up a plastic box with big block letters. "Emergency Signal Kit." Lance took the case and opened it quickly. Finding the flare gun inside drew an excited whoop from him. "Bet it blows up now," Dexter said. He moved them away from the dock gently as he got the hang of the controls. The boat rocked hard and the boys spun to see Spaz climbing over the side to join them. Dexter jumped from the controls and body-checked him before he could get his balance. The fan blades caught the vines and diced them. Lance and Dexter exchanged glances. Dexter ducked under Spaz's swinging fist and dropped to the deck behind him. "Let's toss this salad," Dexter shouted. Lance jumped over the steering column and kicked Spaz with both feet, sending him careening over the prone Dexter and into the fan. Spaz's mulched remains sprayed behind the boat as his body passed through the oversized food processor with ease. "Let's toss this salad? That was the best you could come up with?" Lance laughed. Dexter scooped the flare gun and slapped it against Lance's palm. "Shut up and burn the house down already." Gladly, Lance sat up and fired at the tanks. They watched the fire spread through the tall grass. It moved placidly until it met the dried, ancient timber of the house. The structure flared like a match head, spreading its light across the black water. Somewhere in the swamp, a baboon cried out as it watched its home burn. "Think the girls have taken a shower yet?" Lance asked. "Probably." Dexter turned the steering wheel. "Can't hurt to double check." The fuel tanks exploded behind them, but they didn't bother looking back. Dexter sped up, maneuvering through the bayou. The experiments were loose, but at least the doctor wouldn't be making any more. They would tell the authorities what happened. Eventually. There were more pressing matters to attend to first. They smiled through the blood and grime and aimed the boat toward the cypress maze.
Well, my friends, our time has come to an end, and I hope your friends, family, little ones, and everyone else you've shared this with enjoyed themselves. And remember, we'll be back here on Halloween Day with a very special Halloween story, not necessarily appropriate for the kids, but terrifying nonetheless. And I look forward to seeing you there. So now, enjoy your weekend before Halloween. Stay safe, dress up in wild, fun costumes, get all the candy you can, or hand out all the candy you can bear, and make the most of your holiday season along with me. If you enjoy what we're doing and you want to show us some support, you can go to your favorite podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, among many others, and hit subscribe so you never miss a single terror tale. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps new people discover the show when they see how many are already enjoying it. And if you want to take one step beyond that to help us make the program possible, you can go to weeklyspooky.com, and for as little as $1 a month, you can become a patron. Just click on Patreon at weeklyspooky.com and you can help us make the program every single month. As little as $1 gets you all kinds of bonus content and so much more. And speaking of, if you want to go even further than that, you can become a Patreon podcast booster, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show. And they are Julia Kirsch, Christopher Sullivan, Brent McCullough, Gino Lyons, Steve King, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, Jeff and George Hilton, Craig Cohen, and Kevin Fry. Thank you all so very, very much. I love bringing the scary, and to be honest, I came up with this idea kind of off the top of my head that I wanted to sit down and make sure I put together some stories just for the families out there. But now it's about time. It's about time to return to our terrifying, scary adult roots. But we may just make another trip to the family-friendly territory, if that's what you all would really like. So until Halloween, I'll talk at you later.